Good evening. Welcome to Reflections on East Granby. Today's date is Tuesday, October 5th, 2010. Our guest tonight is Barbara, maiden name Griffin, Skinner, of Winding Hills in East Granby. We'll be interviewing her tonight and talking about her life as we have with all our other guests. Thanks for joining us. Good evening, Barbara.
Good evening, Mike. Nice to see you.
Same here. It's a pleasure to get. Initially, we had difficulty getting women to come on, but as we go along, it seems like more and more are comfortable. As they less once they see other people on, it seems to be more. The comfort level increases. Okay, you were born in July of 1934 in Middletown, Connecticut. So why don't we start like we do with everyone, and you can give us a little background. What are your earliest memories of Middletown?
Well, I lived in several places in Middletown. I was born lived on Prospect Street, and then moved to Old Mill Road, and I went to started kindergarten in Middletown with the school system that they had.
And that consisted
parents
of?
had to carpool because it was the outer rim of the city.
Okay.
And so I carpooled. And then in first grade, they decided that they didn't have room in Eckersley Hall anymore. I had to go to Hubbard School. And in Hubbard School, the town taxi took us to school.
Really? Literally a taxi, or was it?
Yeah,
it wasn't a bus?
With the jump seats in it.
Oh,
the old
really?
taxis.
Wow.
There was only about 5 or 6 of us on the
So
hill.
this would have been in the late
going.
30s.
Yes, and then of course World War II was on. Then in third grade they decided.
Well, let me just stop you for 1 second. You said a two-tier school system, or two?
Well, it was the inner city school system, and the outer perimeters of Middletown. There was another school system.
Completely independent.
Right. They had two
Really?
high schools: Middletown High School and Woodrow Wilson High School.
Was the town well? Obviously, it was large enough to support it, but was it that different between those two areas of town? That I've never heard of that before. I've never heard of sequestered school.
Right.
System.
No, they did that for many, many years.
Really?
I don't know how it worked. It just worked, I guess.
It's different.
They had 2 superintendents of, one with the city and one with the town school system.
Okay. Interesting. Okay,
So in third grade, they decided I could go to the local school, so I had to walk a mile to school.
Okay.
But because I had to cross Route 66 in Middletown, Washington Street,
right.
They sent a city cop to watch us go across the street.
Like walk you across.
And he got tired of going one kid at a time, so he would go around the hill and pick us up. So I went to school in a police car.
Wow.
Then we moved to Newfield Street, and I had to walk to school.
Kind of creative ways that they got you to school.
4th and 5th grades there. And in 5th grade, I lived a couple of doors from Professor Wilbur Snow, who at the time was the lieutenant governor of the state.
Wow.
So at times I went in the number 2 car to school because he would pick me up with his son.
Wow. Yeah.
So I had interesting rides to school, that's for sure. And then my folks had bought a house in East Hampton, so I spent my high school years in East Hampton and graduated from East Hampton High.
Okay, so growing up in Middletown, Middletown even today is a fairly good-sized town. Did it have a proper downtown? It was a pretty sizable.
Oh yes, they had a beautiful main street with department stores on it. My mother worked in Rubles during the war years.
Rubles?
Rubles was a clothing store for women and children.
Okay.
And Bunce's was a regular department store, and yes, Middletown was a thriving. They had a Montgomery Ward and a Penny's and the usual drugstores and so forth. And Camp's was a big men's store. And
what was the large local industry there? Do you remember? Was there anything?
Russell Company, where my mother worked, was they manufactured brake lining and parts for cars. Or of course during wartime, it was wartime efforts.
I think most people don't.
B.F. Goodrich, which was a big sneaker method of manufacturing.
Oh, the rubber soles.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, people don't make that connection.
Right.
But I think a lot of people don't understand that in that day there was a lot more in the way of independent manufacturing concerns. They weren't all conglomerates. B.F. Goodrich was probably pretty large, but a lot of small department stores and stuff that made up the downtowns. Okay, so you're growing up in Middletown. Any other memories from that era before? What age did you move to East Hampton?
Let's see, I was 13, 17, 12. I was 12 because I did 8th grade in East Hampton.
Okay.
And that was part of that was the beginning of the junior high system. That was introduced into the school, and it was a national kind of thing that was broadcast about how great it was and everything. They had, so you had 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and then the 4 years of high school.
So prior to that, what you did elementary school up to like 8th grade, and then you jumped to high school? Is that how they did it? So you had, okay.
In Newfield Street, I was in a 2-room school.
Okay.
And in Saddle Hill, I was in a 3-room school. So
Wow.
I've been in small schools and big schools.
I guess so, yeah. So you're, so when you moved, you were probably at a pretty impressionable age. That's when your real kind of adult-style memories started, about that age. So you,
Well, I graduated from in high school when I was 16. I started working at Thatcher's drugstore
Right.
as a soda jerk.
okay.
And in those days, you had to wait on the customer. They couldn't pick up what they
They called
wanted.
you that because you were constantly pulling that handle, huh? Just, right.
And then that was Ray Thatcher was the comptroller of the state of Connecticut.
Okay.
And he owned the drugstore, and he was a pharmacist.
Okay.
When he lost the election, he came back to work at the drugstore. He was kind of a bitter man.
Was he? Yeah.
But he got over it. He was really a terrific man.
Oh, great.
And I worked there, well, from the time I was 16 until I graduated from high school. And when I graduated from high school, I went into nurses training back at Middlesex, where I was born.
Oh, okay. So that was your career choice, and you went. Now, just walking through the years, I mean, you're getting into the late 40s, early 50s at this point.
I graduated in 52.
Okay.
Well, in 55 from nursing school.
So 52. So your memories probably of the war were as a child.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, you were
Yes.
10.
And my folks sheltered me. My father didn't like the idea that I knew too much about it.
Yeah, well, I don't think that was kind of the way of the day back then. You didn't really share that kind of stuff with kids unless you.
I remember the rationing that we had.
Right.
My mother used to give my grandmother down in Bridgeport sugar so that she could can her peaches and make jelly and jams and stuff. I spent my summers down there in Bridgeport with my grandmother and grandfather. And
Right on the shore.
No, not on the shore.
Well, it was Bridgeport, the city's on the shore.
Yeah, but the north end of the city, which was a very nice area at the time, which isn't so nice right now.
No, they're going through some changes. But do you remember Seaside Park as a child?
Yes, I used
That's
to
been
go
there
there.
since then, right?
And Pleasure Beach was the lake compounds of the era.
Really?
Of the area.
Yep.
And used to go there, and I loved the merry-go-round and the whip.
Yeah, I've been through Bridgeport a few times in the last few years, and I was struck by what a beautiful town it must have been. And parts of it still are. They're kind of going through some renovation now. But the coast there is stunning. It really is. It's nice. So sounds like you had a pretty happy childhood.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was an only child until I was almost 14, and then my brother was born.
Really? Okay. What did your parents do? You want to share their names?
Well, my mother worked, like I said, in
right in the
Russell Company, and she was what they called a comptometer operator.
Okay.
Which dealt with IBM cards and doing payroll.
Okay.
And my father, he had been brought up from Stratford by his uncle, who ran the Pickering Governor Company over in Portland.
Oh.
And so he wasn't, he was eligible for World War II, but he was frozen in his job, they said, because he was the inspector on the governors.
Okay.
And then when we moved to East Hampton, my father went in business for himself as a house painter, because that was his training from when he had left 8th grade.
Really?
He didn't go to high school.
Okay.
He became an apprentice as a painter. And then he also worked on oyster boats outside of Bridgeport.
So this was after the war?
Well, that was, I'm talking about Depression years before I was
before.
born.
Okay, before.
But during
yeah.
the war is where he was at Pickering's.
Okay, so yeah, and then he stayed there for an extended period.
Well, actually, the company was bought up by a company in New Hartford that made machines that made plastic and glass containers.
Oh, okay.
And he got out of it and went in business for himself.
So your brother came along when you were how old?
I was almost 14.
So that must have been quite
was a
change.
shock to everybody.
I bet, but yeah, that's got to be quite almost a generational difference there between you and your brother.
Yes, it was. Because I started dating my first husband, Bill Horman, when my brother was 3.
Wow. So you went. That's amazing. So you went to school to be a nurse. Okay, and why don't you just walk us through your early career? And you said you met your husband when you were
in high school, senior year of high school.
Okay. Wow. Okay. That was probably a little more traditional back then. I mean,
right,
people
right.
tended to. So you had you went to school. You became a nurse. Where'd you go to work?
Well, I stayed at Middlesex, working in a newborn nursery
Okay.
for about 6 months, and then my husband had gone into the Air Force. He wasn't my husband then, but he went into the Air Force and went through the cadet program, so he was a pilot. And
This is during the Korean conflict?
no, he went in 54, so this was
just after.
55 when he began as a cadet.
Okay.
And between primary and basic training, we decided we'd get married. I was now 21 and he was too, so
Okay.
we got married. We weren't supposed to be married. They could have bounced him out of the cadet program.
Okay.
However, and I went down to Texas. And down in Texas, I got a job at a small hospital there that was run by some nuns from Minnesota who hated Texas. And I worked nights there.
And he was
For
stationed
about 5
where?
months. He was at Bryan Air Force Base,
Okay.
finishing his basic, and then in August of '56 he got his commission and was assigned first to multi-engine. He had been flying jets, and he was assigned to multi-engine airplanes. He wasn't too happy, and when this assignment actually came through, it was for helicopters.
That's quite a difference.
So we went to Randolph Air Force Base in San Antonio and stayed there for, I think it was about 3 months. And then he was sent to Greenville, South Carolina, and that's where our son Gary was born. So we have a Southerner.
Right.
And
Does he have an accent? No, I'm just kidding. No.
then we went up to, he had to go to Labrador.
Okay.
And so I went home and stayed with my folks for the year with my 5-month-old son.
Right.
And then he was assigned down to
Back to
Selma,
East
Selma, Alabama.
Okay.
And that was the years before 1959. And
Now, let me just stop for a second. What was your impression as a Northerner of that sort of? Because I think that was, in some ways, it almost
black was black and white was white.
and it was very defined.
Very defined.
Yeah.
You had water fountains that named it colored. Restrooms, men, women, and colored.
It's fun, this discussion with a few guests, and the majority of them were exposed to it through the military. But that's how they ended up in southern areas that were.
But I had nothing to do with the military when I was working at the hospital in Texas.
Right, right.
And it was go home Yankee. We don't do
Okay.
things this way.
Right, right.
I worked in the emergency room, and if I were, on the weekends you'd get the barroom fights, and these guys would come in and they'd walked into knives or they got knocked about the head or something.
Right.
And as a nurse, I was trained to give the cardinal symptoms, which would be their name and their age and their blood pressure and their temperature and their problem.
Right.
And I had to call the doctors, and I would say it was a black male, in those days using black, and they'd tell me to put a butterfly bandage on and get rid of them.
Really?
It was very difficult, because it was so obvious that
Yeah.
they weren't going to cater to whether they thought they weren't going to pay or what the problem issue.
Right. So there was a very clear
Very
prejudice,
definite.
for lack of a better word.
Very bad prejudice.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
What as a northerner, you weren't really exposed to anything even close to that. I mean, there certainly was resentment, and there
Well,
certainly
my
was.
best friend when I lived in Newfield Street in Middletown was a African American girl,
Right.
Annie Hunter,
Yep.
and she was, she and I were very close.
Yeah.
She could come to my house, but my mother never let me go to her house.
Right.
And her house was where the brickyard was in, that area.
Right. Right.
And
Right by
I
the
don't
river.
remember the name of the brickyard, but anyway, she used to say it was because of the trucks. Years later, she told me it was because she didn't want me down in a black neighborhood.
Really. Yeah.
So she had the prejudice more than I did.
Yeah. Well, distinctions up here, but I don't think they weren't they weren't part of this accepted society
Correct.
anywhere near what they were down
Correct.
south. So it's quite an experience. Yeah. So you were in Selma. Where'd you go from there? You had one child at this point? Or?
Yes, and then his obligation for the service, he couldn't get out until October of '59 to put in his 5 years.
Right.
And my son was due about the same time.
Okay.
So, but because he was flying the command H-43 helicopter, the twin intermeshing rotor blades,
Right.
it was used for fire extinguishing to be able to go, the prop wash would open up an area so you could get to a plane to get a pilot out if it was a fire on the plane.
Really? Wow. So the actual blow from the interesting.
Yeah, and the men would be dressed in the firemen would be dressed in asbestos type suits,
Right.
and go right up to the cockpit of the plane with the helicopter just making all the prop wash.
Interesting. So, I guess that's how. So, why don't you continue?
Well, that's when the pilot had been down there to demonstrate this from command,
Right.
and he told Bill, you know, you ought to get a job. We're hiring pilots. So that's where we came from Selma, Alabama, up here to East Granby.
And he was
That's pilot
from
command.
where originally? I'm sorry, I meant.
He was born in Mineola, Long Island,
Okay.
and moved to East Hampton when he was in 8th grade or something like that.
Okay, he ended up there. Okay, so now you still have one child?
Two.
Two. Okay. All right.
When Don was about a month old, we moved up here to well, first we found a rent in Windsor, and then we bought the house in East Granby, which was the 5th house up the hill on the Coles
Development.
path there, and we lived there until he unfortunately was laid off in 65, and then we moved down to New Jersey. He worked for the Ronson Corporation, being their glorified taxi cab driver.
Okay. Wow.
But in the interim, when the boys were little, I decided I wanted to go to work. I couldn't stand being home any longer.
Right.
So I got a job at Mount Sinai Hospital.
Okay. While you were still living in East Granby.
And working part-time. And Maribeth Skinner agreed to take care of my boys.
Okay.
And Bill was working second shift at the time. I found out he was taking care of the boys quite a bit of the time.
Okay. So he was.
But I hardly even
This will all
saw
make sense in a minute.
Correct. So like I say, we went down to New Jersey, and again, he was a glorified taxi cab driver for Ronson Corporation, and he decided that he'd like to come up here. There was a plant in Stratford, and I can't remember the name of it, but the man that was there had called him and said, come up and maybe we got a job for you.
Sikorsky?
No, this was another plant. I wish I could remember. Anyhow, so while he was there, he decided he would go over to Sikorsky and see what they had to offer.
Right.
And he came home saying, you know, I'll probably hear from Stratford, but I'll never hear from Sikorsky. He did.
Oh, okay.
So that meant that we came back from New Jersey and we moved, and we found a house in Huntington. So we lived there in Huntington until he was laid off again, unfortunately, along with other pilots. It wasn't all just him.
Right.
And at the time, the German government was negotiating to buy Sikorsky helicopters,
Right.
the CH-53, of which he was a lead pilot on for the testing of them. And they hired him. There was a German here negotiating for all the things of the 200 helicopters, of which they insisted that they'd be built in Germany.
Okay, so they contracted for the technology.
They contracted it, and they got 4 original shells, literally, that were shipped over by boat. But anyhow, Bill got the job with Vereinigte Flugtechnische, which was like the United Aircraft.
I'm not going to try to say that.
The United Aircraft of Germany.
Okay.
And it was in Speyer. And we found a rent, or he found a rent in Reilingen, which was about 16, well, let's say, we go by kilometers over there,
right.
From Heidelberg. And because the USAR headquarters were there, the boys were able to go to a Army dependent school.
Okay.
But actually, I should backtrack. When we moved to Huntington, I started working at St. Vincent's Hospital, and I got pregnant. I said it was because of the Catholic Church, not Catholic hospital.
Okay.
No. So my daughter was born in September of 1967.
Okay.
So she was just 3 when we went over to Germany.
Oh, wow.
And that was 1970. I wasn't too happy there. When he told me
was it the culture shock, or just you didn't have friends, or it was tough to?
Yeah, it was going over there cold.
Yeah, that's quite a.
And at the time, Chevrolet had commercials that was "See America First," and so I cried. I wanted to see America first.
Oh, really? You felt like, yeah, right.
So we
I
went
think
over
when
to
you're a little
Germany.
younger, that's easier. But once you have a family
Right.
established, it's tough.
And we had a very nice big second floor apartment, and we had Americans next door. The neighborhood kind of liked the idea of having Americans for money and access to the post exchange, of which we did not have access to.
Oh,
We
wow.
were aliens.
Right. So you didn't even have anything that you could barter with for
No.
good treatment.
But there was some Sikorsky people that went over there, and one of the vice presidents connived it that they got the green card so that they could go into the
Right.
PX and so forth. And so some of them would shop for me, but
Right.
I had the greatest pointer, what I wanted at the stores.
Oh, yeah, yeah, right.
And it was an experience.
So you were there for how long?
33 months.
Okay. You know it exactly to the month.
After a year, I really wanted to go home, and my husband convinced me that, well, you know, the military stay over here for 3 years. Can't we do it for 3 years? And, you know, the helicopters are just beginning to really start
Right.
taking shape in the plant, and he really wanted to see it
He was
through and
enjoying it.
everything.
Yeah.
He was having a ball.
Yeah.
That was his first love. I was his second love.
Okay.
So we stayed there for the 3 years.
It was
and-
kind of like your tour duty. And so.
Yeah, yeah. And I got into volunteering at the Dependents Hospital,
Okay.
or sick call, I guess you'd call it, only 1 day a week. But we were there when the Bad Mannhof gang blew up Campbell Barracks, which was in I guess it was either late 70 or into spring of 71. I've forgotten exactly when.
That was the era when there was a lot of that kind of fringe violence going on throughout Europe.
It was pretty scary.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Pretty scary.
Yeah.
It was kind of interesting, though. I went up the next day. I was due to go to the base there to work in the dependent sick call infirmary, and I went up to the gate with my Opel Rekord, which was a German car,
Right.
with Mannheim plates, because that was the state that we lived in.
Right.
And I had a uniform on, and they had the Red Cross patch on my sleeve. And I was ready to get out my passport and my registration and so forth when I was stopped by the MP. And he said, "Where are you going?" And I told him, and he got on the old crank phone because they were on alert,
Yeah.
and called the sergeant there, and yes, I was due in, and I went in.
Right.
But every other car was searched under the hood and in back of the trunk, and the seats taken out, and the trucks and everything were searched.
I bet.
So I got into the sergeant, and I told him what happened to me, and I said, you know, I didn't like that idea. He didn't even check my passport, nothing ID.
Right.
You know, I could have been knocked off down the street there and being impersonated,
Right.
you know.
Could have been somebody in your trunk.
So that was reported. So I know that was reported.
Right.
The sergeant was pretty upset about that.
Well, it's interesting because you're referring to a time when, you know, similar to what we went out through in this country and still are after 9/11 with enhanced security and stuff. We were kind of,
Oh, yeah.
for probably 30 years, 20 years, we were
Right.
pretty, well, 20 years anyway, right? No, 30, almost 30.
Well, actually, in 1970, my husband had gone over to Germany first, and then he was allowed to come back to get us to go. And it was the day after Labor Day, and it was the day that the first plane was hijacked, the Lufthansa plane that was taken to North Africa or something, I think.
Okay.
So when he went to the airport the next day, he wasn't sure he was going to get out.
Right.
He said German and American soldiers were walking around with submachine guns.
Yeah.
So that was pretty scary for him.
Yeah.
But anyway, we came back, and he had got a
Quite
job.
another culture shock for you as an American, because that really wasn't
Oh, yeah.
something you saw in this
Yeah.
country.
We decided to take a course in German. At the time, the Boston University had a extension over there in Heidelberg at the base, and you know, they gave us a book to help us, and I opened it up, and it was published in Glastonbury, Connecticut.
Oh, no kidding.
Felt like home.
Piece of home, yeah.
However, he was teaching us High German, and I was not hearing that in the town that I lived in.
Right.
And finally, I talked to the instructor about it. He said, "Well, where do you live?" And I told him. He said, "Oh, they've got their own dialect down there."
Okay.
He said they probably commute in English with their neighbors.
Really?
because that became a common language
Yeah,
then,
right.
and get rid of the accents. that
German's
they had.
actually an interesting language because it's the root language of English, and when you really kind of get a little bit of feel for it, you can get a long way quick in German if you get the basics.
My boys did better than I did.
Yeah, well, at that age, yeah.
And my husband did very well. English is the international flying language.
Right.
And also under shipping, I understand now too. But he still, when they were in the factory part itself, he had to learn a lot of it.
Right, he's have to
Did
communicate
okay. He got
where
by.
we are, right?
So for coming home, he got a job with Erickson Lumber Company out of California.
Mm-hmm.
But they had an East Coast operation. He was flying the Sikorsky Sky Crane.
Picking up lumber, like.
Well, yes, but what he did here was he did some of the things that I remember is the GE plant had just built their headquarters off of Route 15 in Fairfield,
Okay.
and it was a quadrangle kind of situation with the buildings, and they decided they wanted trees in the middle,
Right.
but they didn't want to just plant little trees. They used the Sky Crane to plant 3 big trees.
Oh wow, well that's pretty creative.
And I was
use of
able
a
to go down there and see that done.
So they were just using it for a variety. They weren't really using it to harvest lumber around here. Which,
No,
what they
but
would have done
out
in the
there
West,
they
yeah.
were. And after 6 months, they wanted Bill to go out there.
Right.
And he refused, and he asked me if I would go to work to help out. And I worked for the next 18 years
Really? Wow.
at Middlesex again.
Okay.
And then he did that. Let's see, what did he do? Oh, he went down to EB and got a job as the gantry crane at the electric boat.
So he was able to do what he really wanted to do for most of his life.
Oh, yes. And
Yeah.
then he got a job with Air Command. He was flying for, again, being a taxi cab driver, so to speak,
Right.
with Mass Mutual. He was under Air Command had that contract.
Right. It's a commercial.
Right.
Yeah.
And he did that. He was able to take me on one of the flights, and we flew down in Stamford and picked up somebody at a golf country club, and then we flew down the Hudson River. And that was a very strange feeling because you're looking over at the Twin Towers that were there and the Palisades and these big buildings.
So he took you right
And
through
say,
Manhattan.
Right. Are we supposed to be below the buildings?
Right.
That was the air corridor, so that's what he had to do to go around to Wall Street to land.
You have a lot of jet traffic, so you have to stay below that, I would assume.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Fascinating, huh?
Right.
That was quite an
Yeah.
experience.
Right.
So where do we go from there?
Well, he worked there at at EB for a while, and then he got a job as a engine rebuilder with a company up in Hartford. He kind of flitted around for a while. I guess that's why I had to keep working.
Right.
In the meantime, my son had graduated from high school in '75.
And where was that?
In Colchester,
Okay.
Bacon Academy.
Yep.
And my daughter, of course, had started first grade when we came back from Germany. We had her in we were going to send her to the German kindergarten, but they didn't have a reading readiness kind of program. And we knew that we weren't going to stay there long enough.
Right.
So I didn't want her to
You wanted
do
to make
that.
sure she was at least versed in
So
English.
she came
yeah.
back and was able to stay with start with first grade and go right through.
Makes sense.
So she graduated in '85. My husband eventually got a job with the state where he was rebuilding the engines and so forth for the state trucks in Portland. In the meantime, we were living in Colchester. And then he became a motor vehicle inspector, which everybody dreads seeing.
Yeah, they're not the most popular guys in the world. No.
They're better. They're better.
I'll tell you, I've dealt with them personally quite a bit because of the business that I'm in, but I can tell you, it really depends on the personality of the guy that's doing it.
Well, I'm sure. Well, he was in Middletown. They closed Middletown,
Yeah.
and then he went down to Old Saybrook, and he retired from Old Saybrook.
Okay.
And he retired in '95, '6, something
Okay.
like that. And I had retired in '92. It was kind of like a buyout situation at the hospital.
Right.
And then he got into hit and miss engines, single cylinder engines. In fact, they just had a show this past week here in Granby.
Right. They do. I think it's every year they do a gas
right.
engine. Yeah.
So we were traveling all over with our motorhome, and him with his engines in the trailer, and I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, it sounds like a
He
fun.
thought it was a boring thing for me, and I said, no, I'm meeting all kinds of nice people, and
Yeah.
you know, we went as far as Ohio, down to Evansville, Indiana, and then all New England ones they had too. He was in the Tobacco Valley Club that was out of Cromwell,
Okay.
and then he got ill with various problems that were all having to do with the immune system, and taking copious amounts of medication. And in December of '99, he was on the list to get a liver because he had autoimmune disease of his liver, and
Takes a toll quickly.
unfortunately he went in a coma and he died in February. So then, like I say, I was hearing about Bill Skinner
Right.
in Maribeth. Maribeth had sent me a beautiful letter that she wouldn't let Bill come because of her illness,
Right.
and that was the first time I had really known that she was ill again.
Right.
And then, like I say, she passed away a few months later, and I called Bill, and so Bill, somehow, however, I can't remember exactly.
Now
how
we
it
can
came
jump
up,
back
but
to your babysitter.
my
Bill used to
babysitter-
actually
my
when you lived in East
babysitter,
Granby.
which I didn't know how much he did until now. I'm finding out.
Right, right. He's,
So Bill, and lived in East Granby. I want to tell you about that a little bit too. When we lived in East Granby, the boys went to kindergarten in what is now the preschool nursery on School Street,
sure, the apple tree.
Apple
Yep,
Tree,
Yep.
and because there was no public school
Right.
kindergarten at that
So
time.
you were right on that cusp. We've discussed that with other guests. Yeah, that
Yeah,
when they got a group together and actually started their own kindergarten. Yeah.
And we carpooled to get the kids there from the neighborhood and so forth. And we also, teachers' aid, you know, we took turns, all the mothers took turns with that. I remember the post office being in where Kane's catering service is there.
Right, the white building there. Yeah,
Right,
blue or
across
whatever.
from
Yeah.
J&G's.
Yep.
And J&G wasn't there then, but it seems like there was a little, some kind of store there. I don't know what. The church only had the first edition
Right.
in the center of town,
The Congregational Church.
Right.
It was basically the stone part.
the brownstone.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, then the first white section. Yeah, it was actually two sections built, but the first one.
The first one is if you're facing the building, it's to the
It was
left, or is it the one
it's
behind
attached to
it?
the back of the building.
Okay, so the back part. Okay.
Yeah, and then they extended it out.
Okay.
Yeah. And I don't know.
Now you have a very interesting perspective now, because you lived in East Granby in the '60s, and you
60
left.
to 6,
And you were
February
gone
29th, 60.
1960.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and you were one of the original homeowners in Winding Hills.
Right.
And then you left, and you came back 30 some odd years later. And,
Exactly.
So
Yep.
that being said, let me ask you a few questions about that. What changed the most in that time?
Well, the town hall was where the Northwest Bank is now.
Okay.
And, you know, the fire department was there. My husband was in the fire department. Also, when they were building the Company 2 out there on Seymour Road.
Okay. Yep.
And,
So they'd have
of
one
course-
in the south side of town.
right.
Didn't that fire department burn or something? Or was it the town hall?
It was the town hall
Okay.
and the whole complex there, as far as I know, burned.
But it was connected to the fire department.
Yeah,
Yeah, it
the
was
one
all
in
one
town,
building. Yeah,
in the center
right.
of town, right
Yep.
on School Street there.
Right.
The configuration before Route 20 got in, I don't remember that vividly,
Yeah.
but people have been telling me how you went down School Street and then across over to the church.
School Street was the main street. You had to
Yeah.
go down it.
Yeah. Bridges. A lot of people say, well, in '55 the bridges went out.
Right.
Well, when I moved here, I know, I tell people I swear to this, I came over the bridge, the new bridge was there, the
Right.
one that's there now from Bloomfield to on 187.
187. Yep.
But the other one was there, the old one was there. And
It just wasn't being used.
yes,
Oh, it was
I
being-
do remember driving over it
Okay.
when we were moving into the house on Winding Hills.
Really?
And also,
From Terrafil.
No, from the Bloomfield side.
Oh, okay. I'm thinking of the other bridge. Okay,
Under the
yep,
new one. It
yep.
was right next to the new one.
Okay.
The abutments are still there.
Yep.
And at the other end of Tungus Avenue, you could go into Terrafil on the bridge.
So that
Because
bridge was still there
That
too?
was still there.
Wow.
We lived here a month, and they tore that bridge down. The bridge that went out in '55, I believe now, is the one that went from Old Hartford Avenue into Terrafil, because those bridge abutments are still there too.
Correct, yeah. Boy, there was a variety of different bridges, huh? I never
Well-
made all those connections, but it's interesting. Well, you're a member of the Historical Society, so
Well, not so much the bridges, but
Yeah.
the fact that I lived here and I remember that bridge because I was thinking, oh, I could walk to Terrafil with my stroller and my
Right.
kids, you know. Well, I never got to do it. And then they tore that bridge down. The next month, the other bridge went down.
Right.
Then we had no choice
right.
but to go on.
So you were the last. You saw the last
about
glimpse
the-
of what
yeah,
was the 50
right,
years prior.
right.
Now, you any other other than the bridges and the downtown? Any other changes that jumped out?
Well, Granbrook Park was just used as a little area to go swimming in the river there.
Okay. Because the
and I
houses
do
had been wiped out.
Right.
Yeah, there was
right,
nothing, yeah.
Right. So that's grown a lot with the tennis courts and the things that they
Right.
have down there now.
Yep.
And of course the town complex and the whole center with the firehouse and the ambulance and the town hall and the senior center and the library. The library, when the kids were going to kindergarten, the library was across the street in a little dingy looking building. I
Really?
don't remember it too much, but
Well,
yeah.
It's beautiful now.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is, very definitely. So the population was only a little over, I don't think it was up to 2,500 in the early 60s,
Right.
and now we've hit almost the 5,000 mark. So
Right.
in the interim of all those years, the town has got a lot of houses and so forth,
Right.
but has it grown that terribly much? You know, that's kind of debatable.
In the actual raw numbers, 2,500 people doesn't make a huge difference
Right.
compared to some of the towns around
Right.
us. Yeah, it's
Right.
twice the size. But
And of
it's-
course, the strip mall was built after I left too.
Okay.
A lot of less tobacco around. One of the times when my husband came from Alabama, he came up to like buy a helicopter from command and fly it down to Alabama.
Okay.
And so after he signed the papers that it was now like his, he took me for a ride. And this was in June. And I can remember it was like snow on the ground. There was so much tobacco.
Right. There's still a lot,
shade
but so
tobacco.
much of that land was developed. Yeah. So that's why I say it's interesting because you had a snapshot from the early 60s
Yeah,
and then you jumped forward to
I wish I could remember more of it, really.
Yeah.
Met a lot of nice people then, of course, too. And then, like I say, Bill and I were going together, and we had kind of decided we would like, Bill Horman and I had decided we would like to move north. My son was living on Newgate,
Right.
and my daughter was up in Longmeadow. And we never got a chance to pursue it very much because he was so ill.
Right.
So I kind of felt like I was coming home
Right.
when I started going with Bill, and
Well, it's great that you guys
seeing
found
my
each
house,
other.
and now I've moved up the hill 3 houses.
Yeah. Right. That's amazing, isn't it? It's a big circle and you end up in almost the same space.
Yeah.
Did you, now, I'll just ask you a couple quick questions that I ask every guest. Is there anything about East Granby, having lived in all these different places, that you would change? Is there anything that you'd like to see the town develop, or something that you feel is, and we're not doing this in a critical way, just as, you know, you've been in a lot of different places.
Well, I think that the town is certainly trying to grow. It certainly has grown a lot in commercial,
Right.
because I don't remember anything but farms here,
Right.
basically. You know, all the Windsor's got all that Griffin land developed. It's too bad that more of it wasn't in East Granby.
Yeah, yeah.
We still have to go out of town to go shopping.
It's a common
But
thing.
that doesn't really bother me that much.
You do get used to it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I've never lived terribly close to stores. I like the small towns. Our house in Huntington was on a dead-end street, and you had to go practically out of town to do any major shopping, to Bridgeport
Right.
or Trumbull. Trumbull Shopping Park was on the line. I don't know who owned it really.
Right.
So going to Enfield was be like the same kind of thing.
Right.
Drugstores. I don't want to see a Walmart in East Granby.
Right.
I don't think that it'll ever happen anyway to worry about it.
I think in some ways they have, they've had and your husband, Bill, was on planning and zoning, and he can elaborate, I'm sure, in detail, but the idea was to try to control some of that development so it didn't end up being overgrown, but at the same time encouraging, growth at some level. Now, you have grandchildren?
Yes, I have 5 grandsons and 1 granddaughter.
Wow.
My granddaughter just had a baby in May, so I'm a great-grandmother.
Wow.
And Bill has 3 grandsons and 2 granddaughters.
So you've got 11 combined. Wow. Busy at Christmas time, I guess.
Well, my son stays down in Charlottesville, Virginia, so we don't see him as much.
Okay.
But Don lives in Hebron now, and my daughter's still in Longmeadow, and yes, we do see each other a lot, which is good.
Through all your experiences, and this is going to relate in some ways to your grandchildren, but what would you, if you were to give advice to a child growing up today or a young person, what would that advice be if you could summarize
Well,
it?
listening to your past programs, education has been the key.
Common
Everyone has
theme,
mentioned that.
Yep.
And it is very, very important.
Right.
But another aspect that I feel like I see is the children have so much choice nowadays.
Right.
The world has gotten so small compared
Right.
to when I was growing up. Even when my kids were growing up, they weren't exposed to what's out there now. And I feel that parents need to get behind the kids a little more and kind of steer them. If they show an interest in something, really try your best to get them to pursue it, or at least take a chance at it, or whatever. None of my kids expressed any interest in any particular thing, and
Right.
and I think it was because my husband and I knew from grammar school what we wanted to do when we grew up.
Right.
So it was hard for us to understand what our kids wanted to do. They've all done very well, but in fact my son called me up at the age of 39 and says, "I know what I want to be when I grow up, Mom." "Oh, I'm in nursing school."
Good for him.
So he's an RN.
Yeah.
And he worked in an emergency room for 10 years, and now he's working as a prison nurse.
So I guess to paraphrase, is on some level, your advice is more to parents, is to take a
Yes.
proactive approach.
Yes.
It's a big world.
Yeah.
The choices are endless, and to kind of help steer your kids a
Certainly.
little bit.
That's right.
I think I have a
That's right.
7-year-old. I think that's excellent advice. And he's just getting to the age where you can see that.
Mm-hmm.
And, they want to do everything, which any child would want to do. But you realize as a parent that becomes a deficit at a certain point.
Right.
Overexposure is almost as bad as being limited to certain
And you
things.
kind of feel out what their talents are, too.
Yeah. So it's kind of like a nurturing kind of thing. Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure having you here tonight, and it wasn't that bad, was it? No. And once again, we are Reflections on East Granby. This is a pleasure to sit down with these folks and go through their lives with them, and we hope you're enjoying it as much as I am, and hopefully our guests are. You can view this online at gctv16.org, and you can pull up the Reflections on East Granby prompt, and certainly that's available 24/7, but our regular show time is Friday evening at 8 p.m., and we appreciate you sharing this time with us this evening. Thank you.